Oh, cool. A new vegan Footsoldier video.
All of these animals in the forest or wherever we're going, they're rights bearers. So we're not going to intervene and do all this nonsense. No, because that's violating the rights of the animals in the forest. It's better just to leave them at it.
He's kidding, right? Come on. He doesn't want to leave animals to suffer, right?
And I think to a certain degree, they're opposed to veganism. The wild animal suffering, I feel, is opposed to veganism.
He's not serious, right? He's not serious.
It's actually unvegan to do that. If you want to do that, that's actually going against the principles of veganism. Because we feel that it is an obligation of humans, we're going to intervene in nature. So that's an exploitation as well. Go into the forest and perform CPR on squirrels.
Hello everyone, so Vegan Footsoldier recently made a video criticising my views on wild animal suffering, as well as my normative ethics in general. I thought it would be good to make a video sharing my thoughts with you and elaborate on why I think it's important to promote compassion for wild animals. The first thing I want to point out is that I acknowledge that the philosophy of veganism arguably has a deontological perspective, for it rejects the commodification of animals and categorically classifies all animal use or exploitation as immoral. I've never stated otherwise, and I don't believe that concern for wild animals is necessarily in conflict with animal rights. I noticed that Vegan Footsoldier didn't explain why he cares about rights and why he cares about veganism. I think that could be a useful thing to think about, and perhaps if you're watching this video, you could ask yourself, why do you care about rights? Why do you care about veganism? For me, veganism is a useful heuristic for creating a better world. Likewise, I think that rights are a useful heuristic for creating a better world. It is not a contradiction to have your normative ethics sitting in some form of utilitarianism and believe that we should have rules that we do not violate in most real-life situations. It's unrealistic to believe that we can all analyse every decision we ever make in order to maximise well-being, taking into account every sentient being. Rule utilitarianism is a form of utilitarianism which suggests that an action is right if it conforms to a rule that leads to the greatest good.
In this utilitarian world, we have to take into consideration the pleasure of the oppressor. And we have to take into consideration how bad it was for the victim. And we have to take in all weird stuff into consideration, which is just nonsense. What if the taste pleasure that I get from eating chicken, for example, I weight that more importantly than the life of the chicken? Well, then I'm vegan, am I? Because I'm doing the right thing by eating the chicken in that case, and that's a vegan thing to do. What if someone comes up to me and says, look, if you eat this beef burger, I won't eat 2 beef burgers later today. It's vegan of me then to eat the beef burger so I can prevent that person from eating 2 beef burgers later. So less beef burgers have been eaten. So it's a vegan thing to eat beef burgers now, if I can prevent other people from eating beef burgers by me eating beef burgers. Do you see where I'm going with this? It just becomes ridiculous in a large amount of ways.
Of course, if someone came up to me and told me this, I wouldn't take them seriously. And the optimal outcome would be for neither of the 2 people to consume animal products. And that is the outcome I would work towards in a real-life situation. However, I do not want to dodge this hypothetical by just bringing up a practical issue like that. So let's imagine that I know that if I eat this non-vegan product, less animals will be bred, less animals will be tortured, and less animals will be killed. Of course, I would eat the burger. I went vegan for the animals. I didn't go vegan for my own moral purity. By suggesting that you would prefer more animals to be tortured and killed if it meant that your hands remain clean, you are valuing how you feel about yourself over the animals. The animals don't care who it is that tortures them. They just don't want to be tortured and killed. They don't care about how morally pure you feel. This just seems like a clear case of dogmatism. Out of interest, if we push the scale further, if by eating a non-vegan product you ended the animal holocaust, would you rather that the animal holocaust continues if it means that you get to keep your moral purity? Vegan Footsoldier spent a little bit of time giving some reductios on a purely utilitarian perspective, and he made a new video doing this as well. And sure, you can point out reductios on a purely utilitarian perspective. There are well-known reductios on both a deontological perspective and a utilitarian perspective. Interestingly, I spoke to Footsoldier about this a couple of months ago, and I gave him a hypothetical where 50 people are going to be tortured for eternity. And all you have to do to prevent this from happening is to blink. He doesn't think there's any moral issue with choosing not to blink in this situation. To me, that just seems unbelievably counterintuitive. Likewise, I think that allowing children in the developing world to suffer and die from diarrhea would be immoral if we could easily help them. If you think that we are only accountable for our actions and not accountable for our omissions, which may be a commonly held belief among people who subscribe to a deontological point of view, you would have to say that there's nothing immoral about allowing a child to suffer and die when you could prevent that from happening by donating 2 pence. I believe that as our ability to shape and influence the world around us increases, so too does our moral responsibility for the sentient creatures who live within this world. Imagine for a minute that you are a well-off individual who's travelling to a faraway, poor country. You're going on a holiday and you're sitting on the balcony of your cottage, enjoying the sea view. Suddenly, you see a lost child who's slowly dying of thirst. Now in your cottage, you have a tap with clean, fresh drinking water. Do you think we have an obligation to help this child? Do you think it would be immoral of someone to ignore the child and not give her water because you're trying to enjoy your holiday? From a purely deontological perspective that doesn't suggest we are accountable for our omissions, there's absolutely nothing wrong with allowing this child to slowly die of thirst in front of my cottage while I enjoy a mojito. It's fine as long as there's no rights violation. Again, to me this just seems unbelievably counterintuitive. Furthermore, what do we do when there's a conflict between the rights of 2 individuals? How do we decide whose rights are more important? I'm not saying that Vegan Footsoldier doesn't have an answer to this question. Perhaps he just didn't have time to include it in his video. But perhaps it would actually be really interesting for you to make a video focusing on how you think we should resolve these conflicts. What are we going to ground that decision on? For instance, in the abortion debate, how do we decide whose rights are more important? Which rights should be given higher moral weight? Does the woman's right to bodily autonomy trump the fetus's right to life? Or does the fetus's right to life trump the woman's right to bodily autonomy? If you've got one person taking the pro-life stance and the other person taking the pro-choice stance, there's simply no way to resolve this disagreement. From a utilitarian or consequentialist perspective that seeks to reduce the amount of suffering in the world, whether an abortion is right or wrong doesn't depend on the potential rights of a being being preserved or violated. A disagreement between 2 people who hold a consequentialist viewpoint is likely to be a disagreement regarding the empirical facts, and is thus subject to empirical inquiry. In order for one actor to convince their interlocutor to come to the same conclusion, they can use logic and empirical findings to explain and illustrate why one scenario is preferable.
Tom Reagan isn't a utilitarian, he's a deontologist, and he's one of the most important vegan philosophers who has a rights-based approach. And the difference is, he says anyone who is the subject of a life, so a human, or a cat, or a dog, or a pig, or any other being who is the subject of a life, then they have the right to life. They have the right to be respected, and they have the right to not be the means to an end because they're ends in themselves. For anyone who's read any Immanuel Kant, you'll know that this sounds very similar, apart from the fact that being an end to itself is not grounded in rationality, rather in the subject of a life. But if you haven't read any Kant or you don't know what that means, then don't worry, that's not really so important. But the important bit here is anyone who is the subject of a life, so any being, has the right to have their life respected. So you can't just randomly just kill some being. You should respect their right to life.
I would like to see some elaboration on this point. Is a being who is subject to a life merely any living organism? Simply any being who is alive, therefore has a right to life? Is this really a position we can defend? Do plants have a right to life? Does bacteria have a right to life? Simply being alive is not a good enough reason for that being to have a right to life. It seems to me that if the being lacks the capacity to suffer or experience well-being, there's no reason why you would give that being rights. After all, to a being who hasn't got the capacity to consciously experience anything, whether or not their rights are violated doesn't matter to them. On the other hand, a sentient being who does have the capacity to suffer clearly has an interest in avoiding suffering. And it matters to them a great deal if they suffer as a result of a rights violation. To me, it seems pretty obvious that what matters here isn't whether or not some right has been violated, but what matters is whether that rights violation has led to the suffering of a sentient being. Overall, it seems to me that the deontological, rights-based approach is more concerned with the preservation of ideological purity than it is with the actual well-being of sentient beings.
So let's compare these two philosophies side by side, Singer with Reagan, for various different situations, and let's see what comes out, and let's see where this confusion leads us. The government passes new legislation which requires chicken cages to be 1 centimetre larger per cage. For Singer, this is a triumph because there is more well-being and less suffering. A very, very small amount, but multiplied over a lot of chickens, this creates more well-being amongst the chickens. For Reagan, the situation hasn't changed, or it may have gotten worse, because the chickens are still in the cages. They're still being exploited, they're still being abused, they're still all going to have their heads chopped off and be cut up into little pieces.
Even if the situation hasn't changed in regards to which rights are being violated, we can use empirical methods to show that the implementation of higher welfare standards is leading to a reduction in the overall amount of suffering in the chickens. I would argue that this difference in well-being does matter morally, and the scenario where the chickens suffer less is better. This doesn't mean that the situation is optimal or moral. If we imagine we were choosing between two possible worlds, in World 1 we've got a situation where 1 billion chickens are kept in tiny cages. In World 2 we've got a situation where we've got 1 billion chickens kept in big cages. Now, which world would you choose if you had to choose one of them? I would choose the world with the bigger cages, because it is better for the individual chickens. This does not mean that I want chickens to be in cages or I want them to be killed. If you were going to be a chicken and you had to choose between these two possible worlds, would it be a coin toss because you don't think there's any moral difference between these two? I think that if you're being honest, you would choose the world where you suffer less. And this doesn't mean that you wouldn't rather have a world where animals aren't tortured or enslaved at all.
And people are celebrating this as a victory, that this oppression is still occurring. This isn't a victory. If people are celebrating this victory, that's bad. That's worse than if people were saying, no, we need to do something about this.
I think this is a bit dishonest. I don't think that Footsoldier actually believes that if Singer says he prefers bigger cages to smaller cages, this means that he's celebrating the fact that chickens are still being oppressed. Again, if I was to be a chicken in one of these worlds, I would rather it was the world with a bigger cage. But I certainly wouldn't celebrate the fact that I'm in a cage. And I know this may seem obvious, but I think it's important to point it out because I think by using this language, vegan Footsoldier is either intentionally or unintentionally leading people to vehemently disagree with Peter Singer based on something that Peter Singer hasn't actually said. I mean, it's very easy to agree with, isn't it? You know, of course, celebrating the oppression of chickens doesn't sound very good. And just to be clear, I'm not celebrating the oppression of chickens either. To give you an analogy, if I had to choose between two possible scenarios, and in scenario 1, 100 women get stabbed. In scenario 2, 1 woman gets slapped. I would choose the scenario where 1 woman gets slapped. The fact that I would prefer that 1 woman was to be slapped than 100 be stabbed doesn't mean that I'm celebrating the fact that a woman got slapped. I would rather nobody got hurt at all. And the reason why I would choose the scenario where 1 woman gets hurt as opposed to 100 is because I think that if something is bad, more of that bad thing is worse than less of it. I would much rather 1 person got tortured rather than 1 billion people got tortured. And if your intuition tells you that you have no preference between these two different scenarios and it would just be a coin flip, then fair enough. I suppose your intuition is just very different to mine. So Peter Singer can say that he prefers chickens being in bigger cages than smaller cages, and this doesn't mean that he's celebrating the fact that chickens are in cages. There is no contradiction in believing that a bigger cage is better than a smaller cage, and still believing that you would rather these chickens weren't caged at all or weren't enslaved at all.
Singer says, if the population of deer get out of control in a certain area, then shooting them and eating the deer is better than buying meat from the shop. Whereas a rights-based position would say shooting animals in nature isn't respecting the animal's rights just because there is a larger population of them than we would like, then this doesn't justify us to go around killing them, and we should probably look at some other means.
Singer was comparing the eating of wild deer in a population that's getting out of control to buying meat from a shop. What Singer wasn't doing was saying that we should go out and kill deer. And I am sure that Singer would prefer a third option where no animals suffer and no animals are killed.
The rights-based position would say shooting animals in nature isn't respecting the animal's rights just because there is a larger population of them than we would like, then this doesn't justify us to go around killing them, and we should probably look at some other means if it was indeed actually urgent to correct the ecosystem in that area. And if it comes at a great cost, for example, wildlife contraception is available but expensive, then maybe we should pay that cost, especially considering the fact that it's probably us humans who messed up the environment in the first place.
Does suffering only matter when we are the ones personally causing it? Are vegans stupid for caring about the suffering of farmed animals when they are not the ones causing it? I was surprised by this part of the video because it seems that Footsoldier may be in favour of intervening in nature with contraceptives. My question is, why would you be in favour of controlling the population of the deer at all? Are you sure it has nothing to do with the well-being of the sentient beings affected? It sounds like you think we should violate their right to procreate, and possibly their right to bodily autonomy when administering the contraceptives, in order to improve the well-being of the animals. Are you sure you're not an in-the-closet utilitarian?
It will come as no surprise whatsoever to think about wild animal suffering. Singer would say, well, if we can go into nature and reliably reduce wild animal suffering, then we should go in and intervene in nature and kill certain animals or rearrange nature in a certain way in order to reduce wild animal suffering. And if we can surely know that the outcome will be positive, then and that there's less suffering, then we should go in and do that. Whereas a rights-based approach would be, no, we're not going to go and intervene into nature and kill animals because we think that it would be better for other animals and that might be less suffering here and more suffering there or whatever. No, we're not going to do all that because we're going to respect the rights. All of these animals in the forest or wherever we're going, they're rights bearers. So we're not going to go and kill certain animals or violate the rights of other animals or restrict certain animals or do all this and intervene, do all this nonsense. No, because that's violating the rights of the animals in the forest. It's better just to leave them at it and we'll just do our thing and they'll do their thing, and we're just not going to violate their rights. We're not going to intervene. We're not going to do anything. We're going to leave everything the way it is, and as long as we don't violate the rights, then we're cool.
I don't think that Peter Singer is saying that we should go and kill animals. And just to be clear, I've never said that we should go into the wild and kill lions or any other animals for that matter. I also fully understand that from a rights-based approach or deontological perspective, going into the wild and killing a predator animal would be a rights violation. And it wouldn't matter how many animals you would save by doing so, it would still be a rights violation. Even if you agree with vegan Footsoldier on this, what about all the other scenarios in which we could reduce wild animal suffering without infringing on any basic rights? A reduction in wild animal suffering can certainly be achieved in ways that don't entail rights violations, such as helping animals with starvation or disease. In a case like that, where we can reduce the suffering of wild animals without causing a rights violation, would you not be in favour of doing so? Or do you really just not care about the well-being of other sentient beings? I think that the well-being of sentient creatures matters because it is ultimately what matters to them. And I think that if we can alleviate their suffering, we should. Now, if you think about the countless situations in which we could reduce suffering without causing rights violations, what exactly is your issue with that? Or do you just think that humans intervening in nature is categorically bad? Now, I don't want to strawman vegan Footsoldier because I don't know if he does believe that. But if you are someone who does think that humans intervening in nature is categorically bad, do you hold that view consistently? Do you think it is wrong to help children who are going blind due to parasitic infections in the third world? Or are you speciesist? Do you only think it is wrong to help non-humans suffering from disease, but it is not wrong to help humans suffering from disease? I think one of Footsoldier's main issues with me is my motivation for being an activist. I think it's probably quite clear in the way I talk that I'm very much motivated by a desire to reduce suffering. I don't intrinsically value rights. The very reason I became vegan was because I became aware of a large amount of suffering. I saw pigs in crates where they didn't have the space to even turn around. And I would imagine what it was like to be in that situation, how much their body must ache, what it must be like to lose your sanity from a lack of stimulation. I saw chickens being kept in conditions where they were being trampled on by each other, slowly starving or suffocating to death. I saw cows crying after watching their babies being dragged away. And I realized that it's not just me who has the desire for their suffering to end. The very individuals themselves have that desire. They have the desire to get out of their current experiential state of misery and pain. I've always wanted to reduce suffering in the world. In fact, that's what led me to veganism. So it makes sense that I would also care about other issues outside of veganism. If you're someone who just doesn't care about suffering, then of course my content on wild animal suffering won't appeal to you. And that's fine. You can skip those videos. And as soon as this quarantine is over, I'm going to be out on the streets the very first chance I get, trying to convince people to be vegan. And I'm still going to be focusing my efforts on promoting veganism, because I truly believe that that is the most effective thing I can do in order to reduce animal suffering. If you don't care about suffering, there's nothing I can say to make you care. But I know that there are many vegans out there who do care about suffering. And maybe I can encourage those people to think about what a living hell the world is for most wild animals. Perhaps I can even inspire some people to give money to organizations looking to improve the lives of wild animals. Maybe I can encourage someone who's studying biology to focus more on welfare biology, which is the field that looks to learn about the well-being of animals and ultimately inform measures to improve the lives of wild animals. I do understand from looking at my comment section that some people are annoyed that I keep bringing up this topic because you probably originally subscribed to me for vegan content, not animal ethics in general, or certainly not wild animal suffering. And I understand where you're coming from. But from my perspective, people were also annoyed when I first started talking about veganism. You know, people on my Facebook page got really annoyed by that, my friends. And I did it anyway because I felt like it was the right thing to do. And that's kind of the situation I feel like I'm in now. Anyway, I would really like to end this video on a quote. And this is a quote from Richard Dawkins. It's really stuck with me ever since I first read it during my undergraduate degree where I was studying evolution. So here it is. The total amount of suffering per year in the natural world is beyond all decent contemplation. During the minute that it takes me to compose this sentence, thousands of animals are being eaten alive. Many others are running for their lives, whimpering with fear. Others are slowly being devoured from within by rasping parasites. Thousands of all kinds are dying of starvation, thirst, and disease. It must be so. If there is ever a time of plenty, this very fact will automatically lead to an increase in the population until the natural state of starvation and misery is restored. Thank you for watching, and I will speak to you soon.